Hello, Shiver Seekers. Are you ready to follow us into the unknown? I'm Cynthia.
And I'm Stephanie. You found the dark oak.
On today's episode, we discuss the 1986 Challenger tragedy.
Oh, man. All right, let's get into it. Welcome to the Dark Oak, the mystery podcast with purpose. Each month through our charity, the Branch of Hope Foundation, we give a portion of earnings from our Patreon and sponsors to a nonprofit organization related to the first episode of the month. To find out how you can be part of the movement, head to thedarkoak.com, visit us at our Instagram account, The Dark Oak Podcast, or stay to the end of the episode and we will give you all the details.
Hey, before we get into today's episode, I just want to remind our listeners that Stephanie and I are working really hard to build our Patreon catalog, and we're really having a lot of fun over there. So if you are looking for a podcast to support, we understand you can't support all of your favorite shows, but if you're looking for someone you'd like to support, and you want to feel good about knowing a little bit of that membership fee will go to a nonprofit organization, would you consider supporting us over at our Patreon? We sure would appreciate it.
Yeah, guys, we have a $5 tier, which allows you to access all of that free content that you're looking for, all of those bonus episodes, and a portion of that does go towards our Branch of Hope. And then we have a $10 tier, which gives you the same, except you also get a cameo-style video. And I will tell you, Cynthia and I don't hold back on those videos. Everyone that has received one of those videos has really seen the true us. And so far, it seems to be positive. We can't always promise that, but it seems to be pretty positive feedback so far. So I don't think you're going to be disappointed. So we would love to see you over there. A $5 tier, $10 tier. It would help us to know that we're producing something that you love, help your community, and give you a little extra content.
That's right, Stephanie. We have the best listeners. We get wonderful emails and social media comments and messages from you guys, but I think we have gotten the most positive feedback on those cameo style videos. People have absolutely loved them, and we loved doing them. So please join the $10 tier so we can make more. They're a blast.
Absolutely. Well, Cynthia, how was your Independence Day? Did you guys do anything fun?
Well, our little town always does a beautiful fireworks show, and we're so lucky that we pretty much just walk to the end of our street and we can see it over the lake. So that's our annual tradition. We loved it. That's what we did. It was storming out, but the fireworks still went off.
Well, yeah, hashtag Florida in the summer. It's funny, I was scrolling on social media just yesterday, and I think anybody who has listened to us for any amount of time knows that you and I are really into thrifting and decorating and old stuff. We're not decorating influencers by any means.
I was going to say, some might argue we should be.
Well, maybe. That would be self-serving, so I'm not going to say that. But our little town is one of the antique capitals of the United States, right? We have enormous antique malls around us, not even flea markets, just truly antique stores, boutique stores. So we get a lot of really cool old stuff. I'm really into primitive farm stuff since I live on a farm. I think that's really fun to collect those old farm tools and old kitchen tools. And Cynthia has collected some really beautiful art pieces and art easels and really neat stuff. For us, the dirtier and grungier, the better. And then we clean it up and polish it up. And it's so fun, right?
Oh, it's the best.
So all that to say, yesterday I was scrolling on social media and I was following one of the content creators I like who has a beautifully decorated home. And it said July 5th and it had kind of like a candle that was shaped like a sparkler, and she blew it out And then the video that was originally focused on that candle-shaped firework panned out, and she was replacing all of her greenery in her vases with fall colored greenery. And it was like July 5th is already fall. And I'm hanging on to summer just a little bit longer. Like, give me just another month. Like, I'm even okay with August, but we need summer a little bit longer. But she was ready, which just, it did remind me though that spooky season is kind of just around the corner, as crazy as that is. The older we get, the quicker those seasons seem to keep rolling around. But I just thought that was so funny. It literally said July 5th, and she had already put out her fall decor.
That's so cute. I'm like her. I would skip the summer every time. But that's so funny you say that, because I was thinking the same thing today, only I was thinking Christmas. I was like, okay, November 1st for me is Christmas. And it takes me a good month to like completely decorate. So by
Yeah.
December 1st, it's fully done. But I'm 3 months away?
Yeah. Yeah. Isn't that crazy?
It's
Um,
weird.
well,
Yeah.
according to this one content creator I follow, you can already start pulling out your fall decor. So I suppose you could go for it.
I love it. Well, Stephanie, today's episode is a little different in that it's not what I would call a mystery per se. We do know how the Challenger tragedy occurred. However, I am going to provide you with some little known facts that you might not be aware of. So there's some common knowledge facts about the tragedy that honestly a lot of people get wrong. So there is some mystery in that. But I think the real mystery in today's episode is, what is the cost of advancement? Towards the end of this episode, I'm going to quote someone who inferred that the lives lost in the Challenger incident were the cost for NASA's and America's growth and understanding of space travel. And this quote really rubbed me wrong. I just couldn't imagine being a family member of one of those lost and hearing that and taking it well. For our listeners who aren't aware, Stephanie and I are in Central Florida, very near Cape Canaveral, where the Kennedy Space Center is. So, Stephanie, did you ever go watch any of the space shuttle launches live?
I never drove over to the coast, but I'm pretty sure I saw some in elementary school with you standing in the school parking lot. Because remember, it was always a big deal. We would go out in the parking lot because we could see it from where we are, because we're, 2 hours away from the Space Coast?
Yep.
Actually, not even an hour and a half. And in the 90s, I guess that would have been, yeah, so like late 80s, early 90s, when the space shuttle was a big deal. Everybody had their eye on it. They would have all of the classes in our school go out in the parking lot and watch the shuttle. I remember doing that. So I'm sure I did it probably standing next to you.
I actually watched the Challenger tragedy happen live, not on television, but it actually happened in the sky in front of me. Now, I was not at the Space Center, although I did at some points in my childhood go watch them live at the Kennedy Space Center, which was just a whole different experience. I mean, you literally feel the vibrations and, it was incredible. But this one I watched in my backyard because I lived in Orlando at the time, and Cape Canaveral is literally due east from Orlando. So we could watch these space shuttles until they disappeared in the sky.
Yep, that's right. We've considered going over to maybe watch some of the SpaceX launches, which we can still see pretty clearly from where we live. We can still
Right.
see SpaceX, and a lot of those launch at night, which is kind of cool too, because you can see them so clearly in the sky.
Now, did you go to space camp in elementary school? Because I did.
Yeah, we absolutely were there at the same time. What I do remember distinctly is I was not one of those chosen to go in the zero gravity simulator. I do remember being slightly bitter about that.
Yes, that was the one everybody wanted. So every student got to do one of the little space simulation things. But of course, the one everybody wanted was the zero gravity. And I think they let
Yes.
like 2 students do each different one. Mine was not nearly as exciting, but yeah, I'm with you. Still didn't get to do the zero gravity simulator. Now, as far as the Challenger flight goes, I was only 3.5 years old when the Challenger launched. So I have no memory of the actual event. And in fact, at the time, I didn't even know what I was seeing. In fact, when the tragedy actually occurred, I looked at my mom and said, "Oh, mommy, look how pretty," because I saw the fire and I thought it was beautiful. I was 3.5 years old. However, I was later told that this launch was of particular interest to my mom because there was a teacher on board the shuttle.
Yeah, and it wasn't just your mom, it was the entire nation.
That's right. That's true. That's so true. This was going to be the first teacher in space. And I have had numerous conversations about this with my mom over the years. And decades later, she was still so moved, like so many other Americans, by this idea that this teacher, Christa McAuliffe, was going to be part of this mission.
And what a just cool lady she was. It was one of those like America's sweetheart kind of things. I mean, she was. She had just captured everyone's hearts.
She really, really did. So I will tell you, part of what I did to research for this episode is I watched the 2020 docuseries on Netflix called Challenger, The Final Flight. And I highly recommend this docuseries to anybody who has any interest in this particular episode. And you get to know Christa. She was 37 years old at the time of the Challenger incident. I'm a 43-year-old woman, and I absolutely want to be her friend. Like, I just know I would have loved her.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
And because she was a civilian and really represents the rest of us, I'm going to bring today's episode to you almost from her perspective. She's the crew member I'm really going to focus on today, as I think she really does represent all of us. Sharon Christa Corrigan, who went by the name Christa, was born on September 2nd, 1948 in Boston. She was the oldest of 5 children. Her father, Edward, was an accountant, and her mother, Grace, was a substitute teacher. And in her youth, Christa was inspired by Project Mercury and the Apollo moon landing program. The day after John Glenn orbited the Earth in the Friendship 7, Christa told a friend of hers, quote, "Do you realize that someday people will be going to the moon? Maybe even taking a bus, and I want to do that," end quote.
It's so crazy how even our generation kind of takes that for granted that we've done that.
It's incredible. In 1970, Christa married her longtime boyfriend, whom she'd known since high school, Stephen J. McAuliffe, and the couple moved closer to Washington, D.C., so he could attend the Georgetown University Law Center. They had 2 children, Scott and Caroline, who were 9 and 6 years old when Christa died. In 1978, the family moved to Concord, New Hampshire, where Stephen accepted a job as an assistant to the New Hampshire Attorney General. And in 1993, Christa took a position at Concord High School, where she was a social studies teacher and taught several courses, including American history, law, and economics, in addition to a self-designed course called The American Woman. And I would love to take that course from Christa.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Taking field trips and bringing in speakers were an important part of her teaching techniques. Christa emphasized the impact of ordinary people on history, saying they were just as important to the historical record as kings, politicians, or generals. Now, in the early 1980s, America saw huge advancements in technology with the video game industry, personal computers, portable music, and with all of the bright and shiny new things that the 80s brought, quite literally, bright and shiny, right? The 80s.
Yep. Oh, all of it. Take me
NASA,
back.
yeah. NASA and space exploration was a bit of old news. We'd completed the space race, becoming the first to land on the moon. America had changing priorities, like dealing with issues such as poverty, homelessness, the emergence of the AIDS virus, along with a sometimes tense racial climate. So we were kind of losing interest in space travel. So NASA decided to help make space travel exciting once again to the average American by announcing a program that allowed the average American to go to space.
It's so funny because in a way we're kind of doing the same thing now. I don't know if you could say average American, considering you have to fork over some pretty hefty funds in order to go into space, but still it's kind of the same thing, right?
It is. Would you do it?
If I had the money?
Uh-huh.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, I think
Okay.
that'd be so cool.
Okay. No, you
You
could pay
wouldn't?
me the money. No, you could pay me the money and I'd be like, no, thank you. Like, okay,
Really?
well, the claustrophobia alone would stop me. But then You realize that the space shuttle, during its launch, now this is the space shuttle, but during its launch, it would travel the equivalent of 80 football fields per second.
Are you saying this to like shake my confidence in my decision?
No, I'm telling you, like, that sounds like hell to me. That just sounds like hell to me. Let's punish Cynthia for all of eternity. Let's just move her at a speed of 80 football fields per second for the rest of her life. My gosh.
Oh, no. I mean, listen, I have all kinds of qualms of like, is that money well spent? Of course, I'd be like, well, would I spend that money on an experience just for me? Or could I give that money to somebody to like help something? Like, so I have qualms with the money part of it. Like, can I justify spending that much on an experience? However, if like money was no issue, yeah, I would totally do it. Like, just the adventure part of it, I would definitely do it.
Well, I want to hear all about it when you get back because no way, Jose. No way.
The ultimate experience.
Yeah, I guess that's one way to look at it.
I'll keep my experiences here on the ground. Thank you.
Yeah. You know, sometimes the ultimate experience doesn't necessarily translate to a pleasurable experience. And yeah, no, that just sounds, I mean, truly like hell.
You know, just pushing your limits a little. I think
Yeah.
that's just incredible. But it's okay. It's not for everyone, Cynthia. I get it.
Right. But like you, apparently, after this announcement was made, everybody was writing in, writers, actors, news anchors, all wanting to go to space. But on August 27th, 1984, President Ronald Reagan announced the Teachers in Space program.
Boom.
That's right. These teachers would fly as payload specialists and return to their classrooms after the flight. 11,000 teachers applied to NASA. Each application included a potential lesson that would be taught from space while on the space shuttle.
Which is so cool.
That is cool. That's really cool. In her application, Christa wrote, quote, "I watched the space age being born, and I would like to participate," end quote. The applicants were narrowed down to 2 from each state and territory, and then Washington, D.C. I think the Bureau of Indian Affairs had applicants. So in total, there were 114 applicants that were gathered together for further selection processes before 10 finalists were chosen. The finalists went through rigorous training and testing to make sure they would be physically able to go to space, and that's where I would get knocked out. And on July 19th, 1985, NASA selected Christa McAuliffe to be the first teacher in space with Barbara Morgan as her backup. And it was really cute because, of course, there's this big ceremony with Vice President George Bush announcing who was chosen, and it was all televised. But beforehand, the teachers, you know, they were so nervous, and they were asking their superintendents to go ahead and just tell them, you know, this isn't a beauty contest. Just tell us who's going. And Christa had previously joked about how when she went out of town, her husband just fed the kids cereal for every meal. So her superintendent leaned over to her and was like, "Hey, Christa, I hope you've stocked up on a lot of cereal."
Yes. Yes. They had to have known. She was such a cool teacher and just, again, such a cool person. So they must have all been really rooting for her.
Now, Christa gave a short speech upon her selection and mentioned the other 9 teachers who'd been in the running, calling them wonderful friends. And she said through tears that when the shuttle went, there would be only one body, but she would be taking 10 souls with her.
Isn't that the sweetest?
So sweet. So sweet. Get this. Listen to how sweet this is. Of his wife, Stephen would say that the other applicants may have been as qualified as she was, but there were certainly none superior to Christa.
Wow.
I love that. I love that. And with that, Christa began really intense astronaut training. Now, one of the things that was made very clear was that everything on the mission was critical. Regardless of the fact that she was not a professional astronaut, everything she did for this mission was going to be just as critical.
Yep. Everyone aboard that ship has to serve a purpose.
Right. And as you mentioned, Christa was the perfect choice. And the other applicants were like, she was perfect. She was the perfect choice. She was funny. She was humble. She publicly praised the other members of the Challenger crew, acknowledging that they all had all of these years of training and experience, and she'd just, been given a glimpse. Those other crew members were Dick Scobie, the commander, Michael Smith, the pilot, Ellison Onuzuka, Judith Resnick, and Ronald McNair, who were mission specialists, and Gregory Jarvis, who, along with Christa, was a payload specialist. And a payload specialist is someone who is on the ship, but they're not a professional astronaut. So Gregory was like working for an aircraft company gathering information. And Christa, of course, was there through the Teachers in Space program. Now, during their training, the two teachers, Christa and her backup Barbara, became fast friends. All of the crew members were given little apartments while they trained, and Christa and Barbara chose to right beside each other. And Barbara said that within 2 hours of moving in, while she was still trying to arrange her things perfectly, Christa knocked on her door holding a homemade apple pie to welcome her new neighbor. The primary mission of the Challenger crew was to use a space launch system to deploy a tracking and data relay satellite that would have been part of a constellation to enable constant communication with orbiting spacecraft. The crew also planned to study Halley's Comet as it passed near the sun and deploy and retrieve a Spartan satellite. But here's where things get a little hairy. To the public, NASA was saying that space travel was as safe as any commercial air travel. They had everything figured out. The risks were extremely low. At times, Christa's parents or her sister would even say to her, "Hey, are you sure you want to do this? Like, do you really want to fly to space?" And she would respond that it was perfectly safe because that is what she had been made to believe. But in reality, that was not the case. Now, Dick, the commander, did take the time to explain to the entire crew that this wasn't fail-safe. Things could go wrong, and out of all the things that could go wrong, there were humans behind it, and Dick believed the humans more likely to fail than the equipment.
Well, knowing how the story ends, I think that might be true. Technically, there was an equipment failure, but it was the people in charge of that equipment that knew that equipment was faulty that truly were behind it.
Exactly. So for me, at least in the case of the Challenger, the problem was actually both the equipment that did fail, but more so the humans that had repeatedly ignored the warning signs.
Right. And I think there was a good deal of hubris that went into that because there never had been a disaster. So just because there hadn't been one at that point did not mean that there wouldn't be one eventually.
Right.
The problem was still there. So
Right.
I think you do kind of get this false confidence. It's important to stay humble in those situations.
I agree. Let me give our listeners a very, very dumbed down explanation of how the space shuttle would launch. And this dumbed down explanation is for me.
I was going to say, wow, maybe we should word that a little differently, but you got this.
It's you should have seen me like Googling, how does a space shuttle work? So there's the actual shuttle that looks like, a rocket ship, if you envision what a rocket ship looks like. And that's the vessel, I guess, that holds the people and the equipment, right? That's the thing that's actually going to fly. But then there's two solid rocket boosters. A solid rocket booster is a solid propellant motor used to provide thrust in a spacecraft launch. And at about 2 minutes and 5 seconds after launch, the twin boosters expend their fuel and then they separate from the space shuttle. They then fall via parachute into the Atlantic Ocean, where they are retrieved, refurbished, and used again for a future launch. However, after previous launches, it was noticed that these solid rocket boosters would come back with charring on them.
Which is a real concern because these are basically just entire tanks full of fuel.
Right.
That's really all they are.
Right.
just a huge combustible.
Exactly. We can all see where the danger lies, right? This charring was always in the same area around the O-rings. Now, O-rings are rubber rings. We actually use them every day. They're in our plumbing, but the average person, I see them a lot like in my lids, especially for like bottles and jars. They're those rubber circles that help things seal. In a solid rocket booster, the giant O-rings act as seals to prevent the hot, pressurized combustion gases from escaping through the joints between the booster segments. So, again, for myself, in layman's terms, they keep the rocket booster from exploding.
So here we go. Here's the rub. Don't explode.
Yeah, that's right. Please. So after these launches, NASA kept finding that the O-rings were compromised, and eventually it was discovered that when the O-rings got cold, they became especially brittle, and that's when they were at their highest risk of failing.
Which makes sense because, they're rubber. So rubber naturally gets more brittle when it gets cold. It gets more sticky or flexible when it gets warm. Not to make a pun, but you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that.
Even I know that. And I had to Google how a shuttle worked. So,
but I'm just saying that's kind of like, it just is so shocking to me that could be an Achilles heel. Like, how did you not know that could continue to be a problem?
Right. Well, I think they did know because the compromise in these O-rings was heavily documented. Thiokol, the company that built the solid rocket boosters, and several engineers wrote numerous reports saying that they were at risk for failure and that a failure during launch would be catastrophic. Engineers suggested putting a hold on the launches until they could figure out how to fix the problem, but it was believed that fixing the problem would realistically take a couple of years. And this was time NASA didn't have because NASA had an assignment to launch space shuttles. In fact, they had been directed to have 15 space shuttle launches in 1986 alone. That's one shuttle launch approximately every 3.5 weeks. Can you imagine?
No, that's insane.
Right. But there was this huge amount of pressure on NASA to keep these launches coming if they wanted to keep their budget. It was like, stick to the schedule and you'll keep your budget. Lose the schedule, lose the budget. Now, up until this point, the Challenger had completed 9 successful missions between 1983 and 1986. The Challenger's 10th flight and the inaugural mission of the Teacher in Space program was originally scheduled to launch Sunday, January 26, which also happened to be Super Bowl Sunday. But before the crew even boarded the Challenger, the launch was scrubbed because thunderstorms were called for during the 3-hour launch window. It was reported that even in the middle of preparations for launch, Christa was writing letters of recommendations for some of her students back home.
It's just such a window into real life.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't made up. I mean, this is her life, just doing mundane things. And I say mundane, what she was really doing was extraordinary, but it's just her everyday things.
She had a passion for teaching every moment. She's one of those people that, like, if her and I were sitting here talking right now, she would just naturally teach me something. It was literally it was who she was. She had a passion for it.
Yeah.
And a gift. What a gift.
Absolutely. And such a generous giving spirit.
Sure.
I think that's a big part of it.
Now, despite the day's forecast, the rains didn't begin until much later that afternoon, and it actually would have been a perfect day to launch, which is really haunting knowing what ends up happening. It would have been a perfect launch day.
Yep.
Now, Monday morning, the crew got into position in the shuttle, but when they went to close the hatch, the bolts wouldn't engage, and therefore the hatch wouldn't lock. Now, to me, this seems like an omen, right? That seems like scary.
Yeah.
The only way to open the hatch in general was for the handle to be unscrewed and taken off. But this time when it was put back on, the threads were stripped. So a team was
just seems like such a weird thing. Like, how did that happen?
Well, my whole thing is, so you're literally like screwing me into this capsule. Like, how are you going to get me out? Like, how do I know that when I want to get out of this thing, somebody's going to let me out? Like, again,
for me. We've already come to the fact that you will not be in a space shuttle, Cynthia, so don't worry. But yeah, it's just, to me, that just seems so strange that to this date, the most advanced machinery ever created.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, it flew us to outer space.
Yeah, and then could also come back and land. Like,
Right.
this is what made the space shuttle so much more incredible than any of the rockets that would have gone. The shuttle was different,
Right.
was just different and enormous and could carry things and could be flown like an airplane upon reentry. I mean, all these things are just absolutely insane. Insane what it could do. But yet all of a sudden you can't get like a door closed.
Well,
I don't
the
know.
threads were stripped, Stephanie.
I know, but how?
I
How
know.
did that happen?
It's weird, right? It's weird.
Yes.
So they had to send out a team to even fix it. And the job required special tools because once the rocket was fueled up, only battery operated tools could be used. Again, because, these are
Sure.
giant tanks full of gas,
Yeah, please no one smoke next to the columns of fuel.
right? When the tools finally arrived, all of the batteries were dead. It took so long to fix this somewhat simple issue that it had eaten up too much of the launch window, and the launch once again had to be scrubbed.
I don't know if you know any statistics, but this is not unusual to have to scrub shuttle launches. And as a matter of fact, I think that's why some people, and I say some people like the nation, were losing interest in the space program because so many things were getting scrubbed, which is maybe why they had put that timeline, that requirement of so many launches within a certain amount of time. Maybe that was it because the public was losing interest when, because it's like you drive all the way out there or you plan your day around watching it on TV or whatever it is, and then it gets scrubbed. And it normally gets scrubbed right before the launch. They don't
Right.
scrub it like that morning or the night before. It's normally like within like 30 minutes of the launch.
Well, and anybody who's ever watched one of these on television or in person, it's a lot of sitting around and waiting. Like it's
Oh, yeah.
hours. It's just hours of just sitting here. And I mean, even the SpaceX, I remember the very first SpaceX launch. I think they ended up having to scrub that. Am I right? The very first launch, but we sat around for hours watching that, so excited. And then
Yep.
we spent all day watching that, and then nothing happened. So I think you bring up a really good point there. At the same time, I'm glad that they are making sure conditions are perfect. I think that is, you know, a very important thing to do. So I'm thankful for it. But yeah, you're right. It's not exactly exciting to watch.
But like when you're saying, I think it's an omen that it got scrubbed, or is it just space programs? You know what I'm saying? Because the
Yeah.
conditions have to be so perfect. So it's not like I disagree with you that it's an omen, but also some of this is just space. It's just space travel. It's just
Right.
trying to get these pieces of machinery to work at the same time the weather is cooperating. There's just a lot of moving pieces. And also, that everyone's healthy. And, again, they have backups for these astronauts. Can you imagine the day of launch, all of a sudden you're sick?
Right. Right. Well, and I say it's an omen, in jest, because the truth of the matter is it was scrubbed that day. They got in, the door went and closed. They brought in tools to close the door. The batteries didn't work. The shuttle didn't launch that day. So,
I know,
um,
but it is haunting knowing what we know now, which you're going to get to pretty quickly,
yeah.
that, the weather ultimately contributed to the demise of the Challenger. So had it worked in the days prior, maybe we wouldn't have had that situation.
Very true. Very true. And once again, the shuttle launch was rescheduled for the next morning. Now, that evening, temperatures were supposed to drop to below freezing. So, because of this drastic change in weather, the powers that be called the engineering department and asked for an assessment. Specifically, were there any potential issues for a low temperature launch? Stephanie knows the answer to this question. Stephanie, are there any potential issues for a low temperature launch?
Oh, like, again, not a rocket scientist, but I will tell you there may be a few things that don't like ice,
That's
don't like
right.
icy conditions on this shuttle.
And that was the response. The engineering department said, yes, absolutely. The O rings. The O rings are a potential issue.
Like, hey, maybe the thing that we've been writing reports about for, the last year or so, maybe those things.
Maybe. Now, that night, as the crew of the Challenger had their third farewell dinner with their family, they pretty much knew that the next morning's launch would be scrubbed again. That just seemed to be the way things were going, and especially with this cold front coming in, they just figured there'd be another delay. When I say a cold front, I mean a cold front. The temperature was going to be in the teens, which for Florida, especially Central Florida, I mean, that's cold. That's cold.
So unusual, which I think adds to the bizarreness. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's all these things just working against a successful launch.
Right. And generally on the coast, it stays warmer even than it does inland. So for it to be this cold on the Space Coast in Central Florida, it was highly unusual.
That's right.
Meanwhile, in the Thiokol conference room, an engineering team was on the line with Kennedy Space Center giving a presentation specifically about the O-ring problem and the temperature concerns.
Don't do it.
That's right. Don't do
it.
it. They were telling them if they went ahead with the launch the next morning, the O-rings would be colder than they had ever been, ever. And given the previous attempts, things did not look good. The engineers were very concerned. But Larry Malloy, a manager at NASA, got on the phone and argued the data, saying it was inconclusive, in direct conflict to the vice president of engineering, who said it was not okay to launch in any temperature below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Larry Malloy's response was, well, when do you want me to launch? Next April?
I mean, come on.
Right.
Come on. That's outrageous.
And this outburst has been described as highly inappropriate for this environment, and it really changed the mood in the room. So after being pressured, the decision was made that the correlation between the cold temperatures and the O-ring failure was not really there, and the plan was to go ahead with the launch.
Maddening.
That night, in order to prevent freezing, the water spigots on the launch tower had been kept on overnight. So the next morning at around 5 a.m., the rocket was covered in ice with 1 to 2 foot long icicles hanging off of it. I mean, this is no good. Now the concern is when the engines start up, the icicles could break off and damage the heat shield.
Now, can you explain a little bit more about that? When they left the water on, that was to keep the pipes from freezing, or was it to actually keep the shuttle from going into the teens? I don't know much about using ice as a shield, but I do know, obviously we're in Florida, we have a lot of orange groves, and interestingly, there's a farmer's trick when the temperature goes below 32 degrees. What farmers will do is turn on sprinklers in the orange groves, which will then form a protective coating of ice around that fruit, protecting it from getting any colder than the 32 degrees. Is that something they were trying to do too, or this was purely just for the pipes itself?
So the impression I got, and I did not get this information from the documentary because the documentary didn't say, they just said that they left the spigots on. But I was listening to some reports by reporters who were reporting on the space program at the time. And one of them suggested it was so that the pipes wouldn't freeze.
Okay, so it didn't really have anything to do with protecting the shuttle itself. So the icicles were kind of just an additional problem that now they had to deal with.
Right. And here's what's interesting to me about the icicles. So it reminds me of a conversation I had with your husband, Bart. So Bart filled in for me on the episode where Stephanie presented the Frederick Valentich.
Oh, Frederick Valentich, yeah.
Case. So we were discussing this case after they recorded it, and Bart was telling me that he'd served as a pilot, and whenever mechanics had to do any work on these little planes, they would have to take inventory of all of the tools that were used, because if somebody even left like a screwdriver behind, once they were in flight, that screwdriver could come loose and hit something and cause catastrophic damage. And I just remember being like, wow, I never even thought of that. Like the thought would have never even occurred to me. So when I saw this about the icicles, it just took me back to that conversation. And I'm like, wow, something as innocuous as a screwdriver or honestly an icicle could cause so much damage.
I don't know. Frankly, it's taking me back to my Grey's Anatomy days. And, one of our favorite girls impaled by an icicle. I mean, who knew? Now, granted, I was told as a kid never to look straight up in an icicle. So, I feel like icicles might actually be more dangerous than screwdrivers, really. Like for like. I don't know. Or maybe icicles, maybe that's just one of our things. It's, one of us 80s and 90s kids talking about there's things in life that we thought would play a bigger role in our lives than they do, like quicksand and things like that. So
Right.
maybe icicles, maybe that was one for me. I just thought it was going to play a bigger role, in impaling people. So I don't know. Maybe that's one of my own weird fears. But yeah, it could definitely cause a problem, especially when you're talking about fuel, heat, things that should not be wet,
Yeah.
electronic things could definitely cause a problem.
Well, as the morning went on, everybody who saw the condition of the shuttle that day thought, no way, this is not going to launch today. But instead of scrubbing, the launch was delayed by 2 hours because in reality, it was a gorgeous day. It was perfectly clear, perfectly clear. The weather was absolutely perfect,
Frigid.
except for it being cold. The temperature was literally the only problem.
Yeah, but a big problem.
A big problem. For the second time, the Challenger crew boarded the space shuttle. And this time, when they closed the doors, the closeout crew gave Christa an apple.
Oh.
A crowd of about 500 spectators, including the parents, spouses, and children of the Challenger crew, as well as 18 students from Christa's hometown, along with Peter Billingsley, the little boy who played Ralphie on my favorite Christmas movie, A Christmas Story, all attended live. They all watched the launch live. And Peter was the spokesperson for the Young Astronauts program. So that's
Okay.
why he was there watching this launch from Cape Canaveral. In addition, there were many people watching on television, including an estimated 2.5 million American school children. NASA actually had the launch broadcast directly to schools across the country. So they were watching a live NASA broadcast.
Well, from a PR perspective, you want to get as much mileage out of this as possible. Now,
Sure.
again, knowing what we know, this wound up being not so great, but I see why they did that. Of course, they should do that.
Right. Tragically, 73 seconds after liftoff, the Challenger appeared to explode. And this is a gut-wrenching moment to watch. There's footage of the crew's families literally watching this happen in front of them. It's one of the more terrible things I've had to watch, and given what we do, I've watched a lot of terrible things, but this is a tough one.
I've seen some footage as well, and I think the thing that I remember taking away from it was how you can see on their face the complete range of emotions, all of them.
Sure. Sure.
From the moment of takeoff, filled with pride and joy for their family member. And then there's just this total look of confusion.
Sure.
I remember confusion and then just panic.
Right.
It's all of it in a 1 minute segment.
Right. Completely unfiltered. This vulnerable moment that almost feels wrong to watch.
I agree.
It's just the worst minute of somebody's life, and to watch it is pretty tough. Now, at first, some of the families did hold on to the hope that their loved one was coming home because keep in mind in the first moments, even hours, we didn't really know what happened. We knew something went wrong. There appeared to be an explosion, but no one could say for sure what exactly happened. And the families knew there had been contingency plans for the astronauts, plans for them to try to survive in the event of an emergency. So,
Right. And I think that led to some of the confusion of like, did they get out? Are they in a
right,
capsule somewhere? Did they come back? Did they return to the ocean in some capacity? So I think
right.
there was that still going on in their heads as well.
Absolutely. But all of the families were taken by bus to the crew quarters, brought together into the same room, where the spouses, parents, and children were told that no one could have survived. Pilot Smith's wife, Jane, was asked by a doctor on the scene, "Can I give you something for your nerves?" And she said, "I'm not nervous." Oh, sorry, I'm getting emotional. If you have something for heartbreak, I'll take it, but I'm not nervous.
Yeah.
Commander Dick's wife, June, went into Dick's closet and hugged his clothes, and there she found the Valentine's Day card he'd already bought her. He died on January 28th, but he'd already thought to come home from space with a Valentine's Day card. That day was scheduled to be Ronald Reagan's State of the Union address, but it was postponed, and this was the first time in history a State of the Union address had ever been postponed. And Reagan used the time to address the Challenger tragedy instead. And this has been widely regarded as one of his best presidential speeches. Back in the NASA control room, everyone who worked on the launch literally had to lock down and go through all of their data to try to find out what had gone wrong. This was really serious. No one was allowed to leave to go to the bathroom or use the phone. It was nose to the grind while a review board was set up to figure out what happened.
Yes, as it should have been.
Right. Now, to the public, NASA remained super tight-lipped about the tragedy. So tight-lipped that they had a spokesperson read a statement, and he referred to the initial flame that can be seen in the footage of the launch as an unusual plume. And when someone asked him, "Do you mean a flame?" his response was, "No, the report says a plume."
It's
he
so
wouldn't,
maddening.
yeah, he
Oh,
wouldn't even
God.
acknowledge that there's a flame where there shouldn't be a flame. It was discovered that there was a flame that could be seen in the right booster rocket. The head of NASA, Dr. William Graham, later went on CBS News, Face the Nation, saying that the solid rocket boosters were primary hardware, not susceptible to failure. That kind of reminds me of the whole ship that cannot sink quote.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, that same day, a photo was published in the press of the flame coming out of this solid rocket booster.
We have eyeballs.
Right. Here's this flame coming out of this booster that's not susceptible to failure.
Oh, gosh. In some ways, I understand why they did what they did, but it's concerning. It is.
Well, and here's the crazy thing. From what I was able to piece together, like Dr. Graham, the head of NASA, had no clue about these warnings, about the engineers' reports. He had no clue. He was speaking his truth. I don't know what went wrong. Like those things were hidden from the people at the top, which is even scarier, quite frankly.
I agree with you.
On February 10th, there was a closed-door meeting where Larry Malloy, remember him, the guy who says, "There's no relation, let's go ahead"?
The guy that just blustered past all their warnings. Yes, I remember him.
Yes. He was outright asked if there was ever any concern regarding the solid rocket boosters, and his response was, quote, "I don't recall any," end quote. Can you imagine? Now, one brave man named Alan McDonald, who'd been in the room during that previous conversation, stood up, raised his hand, and said, "We recommended not to launch with concern about the temperature."
Good for him.
That's right. And with that, an open session was scheduled for the next day. Now, at this session were two very important men. One named Richard Feynman, a Nobel Peace Prize winning physicist who was perhaps at that time the most famous scientist in the world, and another man, Donald Kutina. Both of these men had seats on the Presidential Commission on the Space Shuttle Challenger's accident. Earlier in the week, their fellow commissioner, Sally Ride, had slipped Kutina a sheet of paper. It was a NASA document that the agency was keeping from the press, the public, and the Presidential Commission. It held 2 columns of numbers, one showing the air temperature at previous shuttle launches, and the other showing the resilience of rocket boosters' O-rings at various temperatures. And the correlation was clear. The boosters' rubber O-rings didn't work as well at low temperatures. Now, Sally Ride was a NASA employee, and she was risking her job by leaking an internal document. So Donald recognized it's important, but didn't want to reveal that it came from an astronaut, so he asked Richard Feynman over for dinner. After the meal, Donald gave Richard a tour of his garage, and Donald was a car buff. and was working on one of his vehicles. He had the parts all laid out on the workbenches. And he asked, Professor, the rings in the engine leak when it's cold outside. Do you think cold weather might affect O-rings? That was
Yeah.
all it took. After a
Yeah.
late night trip to get O-rings and pliers, Richard Feynman showed up at the next morning's session ready. Richard told the group he'd purchased some O-rings and put them in a glass of ice water. And look, they become brittle and don't work. Now, witnesses at this session joked if anybody else had done this really simple experiment, they would have been laughed off the stage. But this was Nobel Peace Prize winning physicist, and his experiment forced the attention to the temperature.
You know what's interesting about this? I just saw Netflix put out a new documentary on Sally Ride. Have
Oh,
have
I
you
have
seen it?
not
Yeah,
seen
it
it.
just it
No.
just popped up like a week ago. I wonder if it goes more into her being so brave because she went on to have a whole incredible career of her own. But I wonder if they covered this part in there too.
I will have to watch it because that would take a lot of guts. I mean,
Uh,
going up against NASA, not just your
well,
employer, but NASA.
Well, to be a woman in the space program was pretty gutsy and ballsy to start with. And then to do something like she just did, which was the correct thing to do, mind
Sure.
you, but that she was brave enough to do it. Can't say I know much about her story, but you've really piqued my interest now.
Oh, good, good. Well, eventually, Stephanie, it all came out. Numerous records of O rings being compromised, and on the night before the launch, the engineers were saying the launch was not safe. As a result, William Lucas, a director at NASA, announced his early retirement. And in the 2020 Netflix docuseries I cited at the top of this episode, he was interviewed. And all of these years later, he said that he stands by the fact that he did what he thought was right. The lives lost were the price for advancement. He went on to say that if he was going over it with the same information he had at the time, he would make the same decision because he thought it was right. He said he didn't think he did anything that was wrong then and didn't do anything that he thinks is wrong in retrospect. I think those are powerful words because here's the thing. If they didn't have the documented warnings, okay, I can get behind that. I mean, everything has a price, right? Advancement does have a price. Sometimes war, as awful as it is necessary and lives are lost, right? There's a price in everything. But they had so many documented warnings. So I think to ignore those, it's unforgivable, truly, for me.
I think there's a couple different points. The first one is I do wonder, does he say that because he really does believe that? Or does he say that because that's what he needs to tell himself? I think there's different headspaces you could be in. But I do think when you are in this space race, I do think you make concessions. While it's not comparable to the Challenger tragedy, I was reading an article not too long ago about a dog, the first dog in space that the Russians put into one of their ships. I'm trying to remember the dog's name. Okay, let me look it up real quick. Okay, I wanted to make sure that I was doing the story justice, so I looked up the article really quick so I could give you some of the details. So her name is Laika, Laika. I'm assuming that's how you pronounce it. It's in Russian, but Laika was a stray dog from Moscow, and she became the first living being to orbit the Earth on the Soviet Union's Sputnik 2 mission in 1957.
Wow.
Yeah, wow, but here's the deal. Sputnik was put into space knowing that it did not have the technology to return to Earth.
Okay, unacceptable.
So
That's
this
awful.
dog, so this dog, they put monitors on the dog so they could see how long the dog was living, like what the dog was experiencing.
No,
And
that's
they put the
terrible.
dog in space knowing that it was never going to come back. And they've justified it by saying we needed to know what would work before we sent a human into space. And is that true? Yeah, but also no. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? It's this what is the cost? So I think Leica the dog would also fit into this category of what cost is too much. So now we have this scale of like, okay, is sending a rat into space that we know will perish. Is that too much? Sending a dog? Sending a chimpanzee? Sending humans? Like, at what point do you say, okay, that's too far? Okay, that's too far. We're not going to do that. I know everybody is kind of looking in retrospect about Lake of the dog, who was picked because she was so sweet.
Oh,
That's why she was picked.
no. Messed up.
Yeah, they put her in there with some food and some water, and they know that she lived some like 18, 24 hours, something like that, before she froze to death.
Oh my god.
So it's an awful, awful, awful story. But at the time, they felt that was necessary. So I do feel like that fits into what we're talking about right now. Like, what cost is too great?
Well, and that's exactly why I wanted to bring this episode today, because to me, that really is the mystery. Because if you have someone like me, and probably you, Stephanie, we just probably wouldn't even go to space, because I wouldn't put a rat on a space shuttle. You'd never get anything done, because I would be like, well, we can't do that. I think these are such big questions. And honestly, I don't know what the answer is. Like, I don't know what the right answer is. I know if it were up to me, no dog's going to space, nice or mean, quite frankly.
Well, no, of course not. And so then you think out there in space by herself, it's
Right.
just awful to think about. Now, with humans, at least they're making a choice. Now,
Sure.
were they going into it with eyes completely open about how safe the program was? They were truly putting their lives in the hands of people they thought had their best interest at heart. And now that everything has come out, it probably wasn't their best interest. It was the best interest of the space program.
Right, right. Well, and I'm totally fine with humans making this choice if they have all of the information. If
Right,
you're honest with them and upfront about here's the risks, here's what we've seen. I mean, honestly, the Challenger was originally a test vehicle. It was designed
right.
to be a test vehicle. So, if they're given all of the information and they still choose, kind of like you saying, yeah, I would go to space. Great, more power to you. Me, no, I'm not making that choice. I rode mission space at Epcot, and that was enough for me. So, I think that's a big,
Equivalent. I mean, how could you expect anything more?
honestly, it feels like you're going to space. You have the G forces, you're in a super small uh
Let's have an astronaut
cube.
on and ask them if it's the same.
I mean, well, I mean, I feel like I practically am an astronaut now after writing that. So,
Congratulations, Cynthia. Congratulations, astronaut Cynthia.
yeah. But all that to say, that's for me the mystery in this episode, because I don't know the answer. I don't have the answers. I just know that I see some problems here, and I'm bothered by some of the choices that were made. On that note, Larry Malloy was also interviewed for this documentary, and I do give these guys credit for facing up, for owning up, and at least giving their side, because I don't know if I thought I might be responsible for this tragedy and the loss of these lives. I don't know that I would be willing to go talk about it in public and be the bad guy. Larry Malloy's response was that he said he figured he probably was to blame, but he felt no guilt.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that one,
Interesting. I find those two things interesting.
I thought it was an interesting response as well. Now, maybe it was edited in a way to make him look like a bad guy, but I was like, "Ew, that's that's rough."
Yeah, it's a little brutal. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, the remaining shuttle launches for 1986 and all of 1987 were canceled, while the solid rocket boosters were redesigned. And on September 28th, 1988, NASA launched Discovery. It was the first launch since the Challenger disaster and was known as the Return to Flight mission. After the redesign, no solid rocket booster ever failed again. And for the next 15 years, the space shuttle flew 86 successful missions. On February 1st, 2003, the Columbia broke apart during re entry. All 7 crew members were lost, and an investigation revealed a similar failure to fix a well documented issue. In 2007, Barbara Morgan, Krista's backup, ended up becoming a professional astronaut and flew aboard the Endeavour, becoming the first teacher to actually make it to space. I thought that was pretty cool.
It's incredible. In that Columbia situation, it's almost like Is there just complacency that grows in these situations? I mean, it seems impossible, but it seems to be happening.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't have an explanation for it. I mean, I don't think I'd be able to sleep at night. Now, I told you at the top of this episode, I would share some facts with you that you may not be aware of. I wasn't aware of some of these things. So, first of all, the Challenger did not actually explode. Because of that faulty seal, a cloud of fire engulfed the space shuttle at an altitude of about 46,000 feet. So it looked like an explosion. The media called it an explosion, and even NASA officials mistakenly called it explosion initially. However, later investigations showed there was no detonation. It didn't actually explode the way we think of an explosion.
Okay, interesting. But also, that sounds like it might have been worse for the crew.
Yes. Yeah, I think so. In reality, what happened, the fuel tank itself collapsed and tore apart. And the resulting flood of liquid oxygen and hydrogen created the huge fireball. But like
Oh,
you mentioned, because the ship didn't actually explode, the astronauts did not die instantly. After the collapse of the fuel tank, the Challenger itself remained momentarily intact and it actually continued moving upwards, with the inertia. It is kind of interesting to watch, but also it's
yeah,
awful to
exactly.
watch. The Challenger itself did stay intact and keep moving upwards, but without the fuel tank and the boosters beneath it, the strong aerodynamic forces were too much for the orbiter and ended up pulling it apart. And then from there, the pieces, including the crew cabin, so the cabin that the crew was in, reached an altitude of about 65,000 feet. So after the fireball, it continued going upwards about 20,000 feet. That's how far it traveled
Wow. I
before
did
it
not
ended
know
up,
that.
yeah, before it ended up falling out of the sky into the Atlantic Ocean below. And it's believed that the Challenger's crew survived the initial breakup of the shuttle, but lost consciousness due to the loss of the cabin pressure and probably died pretty quickly due to oxygen deficiency. The cabin hit the water surface at more than 200 miles per hour, 2 minutes and 45 seconds after the shuttle initially broke apart. That's a long fall, 2 minutes and 45 seconds.
Yeah, but hopefully, if they had lost consciousness, at least they weren't suffering.
Hopefully.
I mean, that would
However,
be a blessing.
it would be. And we can hope that's what happened. However, it is unknown whether the crew could have potentially regained consciousness during any of that period. NASA did release a transcript of tape recordings in the flight's final seconds, and according to the transcript, the last recorded communication by any of the astronauts was the comment, "uh-oh," made by the pilot, Michael Smith, 73 seconds after launching. So right before we see the flame.
Oh, I hate that.
NASA also disclosed that at least 3 of the 7 individual emergency breathing supplies on the shuttle had been manually activated, indicating that the astronauts were aware and were struggling to survive in the spacecraft's final moments. There were indications that one of the packs could not have been turned on by the person using it and that one of his companions had to have turned it on for him. So there is evidence to suggest that they were alive for at least some period of time after that initial breakup. Within a day of the shuttle tragedy, salvage operations recovered hundreds of pounds of metal from the Challenger. However, most of the spacecraft has remained in the Atlantic Ocean. In 1996, 2 large pieces of the Challenger washed up in the surf at Cocoa Beach, just 20 miles south of the Kennedy Space Center. And in 2022, so just 3 years ago, a 20-foot piece of the shuttle was found off the coast of Florida by a documentary film crew. That's amazing to me that we're still finding pieces.
Right. And I'm assuming the crew was recovered, though, correct?
The crew was recovered. Yes, that they did recover the cabin with the crew inside. I'm going off memory, so I may have this wrong, but I believe that may have happened in March. So the accident was January 28th, and I believe it was maybe mid-March when the cabin
Oh, wow.
was recovered.
So it took a while for them to find it.
If I am remembering that correctly, which I'm pretty sure I am, it's not in my notes, so there is a little room for error there. But yeah, it took a little bit of time. Now, despite being such a large part of history, relatively few people actually saw the Challenger disaster unfold on live television. So I told you previously, millions of people watched the Challenger launch, but all of the major networks cut away when the shuttle broke apart. CNN did broadcast the launch in its entirety, but cable news was relatively new at the time, and even fewer people had satellite dishes, so they don't think there was a large audience watching there. So most of the people who've seen the actual tragedy watched it in replays. However, as I mentioned earlier, though the general public may have missed the worst of the incident while watching live, NASA had arranged a satellite broadcast onto TV sets in schools all over the country. So all of these school children did see the tragedy actually unfold, no cutaways. And they remember the disaster as a pivotal moment in their childhoods. And honestly, so do I, even though I have no memory of it. It is one of those moments, like I've had these conversations with my mom and where she said, yeah, you looked at me and told me how pretty it was. And of course, my mom's devastated knowing what happened. And, then growing up and learning more about what actually happened. I would say it's one of those big moments in my childhood too, despite not being able to even remember it when it happened.
It's incredible your mom was able to hold it together. I remember listening to a few interviews from some of these school children who remember their teachers breaking into tears and having very emotional reactions to it. So, because it was just unbelievable that that could happen.
Right.
And so, yeah, I imagine as a school child, a grade school kid, and you see this thing, you don't really understand what's happening, and then you look at your teacher and she's just losing it. Yeah, that would be cemented into your memory for sure.
Right. And I'm sure my mom was an angel of a woman, a very sweet woman. She cried when Bambi's mother was killed. So
Yes.
I am sure she was fighting back tears, but also knowing my mom, she was keeping it together so as not to scar her toddler.
Of
But
course.
putting myself in her shoes, I can only imagine just how awful that was. Now, I'm going to leave you with a quote from a poem called High Flight by John Gillespie McGee Jr. President Reagan used this quote in his speech on the day of the Challenger incident. Of the Challenger astronauts, Reagan said, quote, "We will never forget them." Oh, I'm already getting emotional. This one brings up a lot of feelings for me, this episode, for many reasons. "We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God." End quote.
Yeah. I mean, how can you not be moved by that?
Right.
Yeah.
So that is the Challenger tragedy. And what a tragedy. What a tragedy. And knowing that it was preventable and that we had warning, it would be a different scenario for me altogether if it was just, hey, we're still learning. We had no way of knowing this could have potentially happened. But this one's rough to think about. I just feel so much for the crew's families, for Christa's children, 6 and 9.
I think keeping this tragedy at the forefront of our minds is important because it reminds us that we should not put ourselves in a situation where we are choosing to put advancement over human life.
Right.
Now, some may disagree with us, and I guess that's the mystery here, right? That's what you're
Right.
bringing. That's the point that you're bringing, is not everyone agrees with that. But I do think we have to do it in a very thought out way with full disclosure and with everyone's buy-in. Had the astronauts been told, here's the situation, they have a 60% chance of failure. Are you still in? But they weren't given that choice.
Right. That would have changed things for me. It really would
Yeah.
have. I would have said, okay, like if you're comfortable with that,
You know the risk. You
right,
know the risk.
right. But for Christa to say, no, I'm not worried at all. I put my full faith in NASA. Man,
Yeah.
that one
It's tough.
hurts.
Tough.
Well, Stephanie, now that I brought you this total downer of a case, will you bring us all back up by sharing a little branch of hope with us?
Oh, yes. Yes. So our branch of hope heralds back to last week's case. Very interesting case, by the way, of Cindy James. We've been getting a lot of feedback on that one. I think the majority of people think Cindy was her own worst enemy, but I guess we'll never know for sure. But I think that seems to be the general consensus. Is that what you're hearing as well?
It is. And I want to adjust an opinion that I shared during last week's episode. So I went back and listened to that voicemail that you said you believe sounded like a woman, that really scary one. And we shared it on our social media. After listening to it again, I think you might be right. I think that actually might be a female voice.
I only gave the opinion that was a female voice, but then you have to take the further step of, do you think it was Cindy? And I'm not willing to go as far as to say it's Cindy. I'm just saying it was a female voice. So it does add more fuel to the thought that this may have been in Cindy's mind. So I don't know.
At the same time, one of the few times she was able to describe her attacker, one of the times there was a woman involved. So
Absolutely.
if she's
Absolutely. Like as
telling
I
the
said,
truth,
I'm not willing to say for sure that I think it was Cindy that was making those calls, but I think there was a woman involved for sure. And
uh,
it could have been Cindy. It could not have been. So really twisty turning case. Really good case. But again, it brought up the very sensitive and disturbing subject of stalking. And we know, again, whether Cindy was being stalked or not, that's for you to decide. But we know that many women and men in our country are stalked. It is a crime. It is dangerous. You can be a victim of stalking. And there's this incredible organization called Spark, SPARC, that we are partnering with this month. Spark stands for Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. Now, Spark doesn't necessarily work directly with survivors or victims of stalking, but they can get you in touch with someone who can assist you. What Spark really does is go forth to change the laws and change public assistance programs to help those that have suffered from stalking. You know, it wasn't that long ago, stalking wasn't even considered a crime. It wasn't something that could be punishable. It wasn't something that was a defined term, if you will. And Spark is making sure to change that, to make sure that victims can say, no, I am being violated. I feel unsafe. This is something that needs to be stopped. So they are an incredibly beneficial program. And we are so pleased to be able to partner with them. As we know, in Cindy's case, I mean, it led to her death. So is that something that can escalate? Absolutely. And is that something that we need to make sure is being addressed? Absolutely. So we're so glad that Spark is a program that is doing the work, is really putting in the legwork to preventing further stalking incidences.
stalking is one of those crimes that it seems like it's out there, like you only hear about it in movies or something like that. But when you break it down, like how incredibly terrifying for the people who actually experience this, people in your space, people in your comfort zone. And like you said, in so many cases, there's not a whole lot you can do about it. So it's a very, very serious, scary, dangerous crime. And I'm glad we're able to partner with Spark and hopefully make some changes.
If anyone listening has been a victim of stalking, Spark recommends Victim Connect, which interestingly has been one of our
Wow,
branches of hope organizations, sponsored
look at
organizations.
that.
Yeah, in the past. So we've got some synergy there. So I did want to pass on their hotline number just in case you find yourself in a situation where you need some assistance, you need someone to talk to. That number is 1-855-4-VICTIM. And again, that's Victim Connect. They can connect you with allies that can assist you through your journey, whether that is on the legal side of things, on the therapy side of things, that can help you through this process. But Spark is the one that, again, is bringing about that legal change. and helping with future stalking incidences.
I love it. I love it. So proud to be a
Yeah.
part.
Yeah. And again, if you're on our Patreon, you are going to help support Spark.
And if you're not part of our Patreon, well, check it out and make that change.
Okay, folks, this is the part where I tell you that you should come back again, and I will once again be bringing you the Mandela effect. I kind of jumped the gun last week when giving you the preview. It turned out Cynthia was bringing this week's case. So sorry, you got to come back again to hear my case.
Super excited about.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. But this is a great case too. So no, you didn't mishear me. I just jumped the gun, and it's been a couple of really weird weeks for my family. So give me a pass. I know that you guys will, because you're always so generous, but I promise we'll be more on the ball moving forward.
And we still have it to look forward to. That's the exciting part.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Cynthia. A really good case to keep in the forefront of our minds.
That's right.
Thanks, Shiver Seekers. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye-bye. This episode of The Dark Oak was created, researched, written, recorded, hosted, edited, published, and marketed by Cynthia and Stephanie of Just Us Gals Productions, and made possible by you, our shiver-seeking listener. Special thanks goes to Justice Himes for our incredible artwork and Ryan Crete for our amazing music.